Come, Holy Spirit, fill our hearts and our minds with your wisdom and your grace. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, are familiar with the gospel that we just heard about Jesus calming the sea in the storm. So let me share another short story with you that also refers to peace. There once was a king who offered a prize to the artist who would paint the best picture of peace, portraying peace. So many artists in the village submitted their work to the king, and he narrowed it down to a few. He looked at all the pictures, but there were two that really stood out to him, so he was trying to decide. One of the pictures was that of a very calm, peaceful lake. The lake was like a perfect mirror. I'm sure many of you have seen that one. It's just a dead calm. And the peaceful towering mountains and trees around it just reflected off of it. It was a serene and beautiful picture. Overhead was a blue sky with white fluffy clouds. And all who saw this picture thought, this portrays an image of true peace. The other picture had mountains too. But these mountains were rugged and bare. Above was an angry sky with thunder, lightning, and rain falling heavily. Down the side of the mountain, one of the rugged mountains, tumbled a foaming waterfall, treacherous, ragged rocks as it traveled over. This did not seem to be peaceful at all. But then the king looked closer because he was captivated by it. And behind this raging waterfall, he noticed a bush growing in a crack in the rock. And in the bush, a mother bird had built her nest. There in the midst of this rushing, angry water sat the mother bird quietly on her nest. Perfect peace. And this was the picture that for this king portrayed peace. He chose the second picture, contrary to what others might perceive, because peace does not mean to be in a place where there is no noise, no trouble, no hardness of heart, no hardship. Peace means to be in the midst of all those things and still be calm in your heart. That is the real meaning of peace. This is the peace that only Jesus, God, can provide for us whilst going through the midst of storms in our lives. This story of peace brings to mind one of the many things that I observed during my time in San Juan, Puerto Rico recently. We strolled along the streets of Old San Juan, which at one time was a beautiful historic area. While many of the houses and buildings had been restored from Hurricane Maria, and beautifully, I might add, some of the buildings were quite dilapidated and still damaged. And one in particular that caught my eye as we were walking down the street, because as I preach, I practice what I preach, I look up. If I'm feeling discouraged or sorrowful, it's just something about it when I look up. I'm always given hope. So as we were peering at these buildings, I happened to look up at this one structure that I'm sure at one time was a beautiful architectural wonder, with all of the crown molding and the wood sculptures and the carvings. But it was dilapidated from the storm and the aging that it had undergone. And one thing particular that stood out to me was a balcony that was rotting. It was a wood balcony that was beautifully hand-wood carved, but it was about to collapse. It was on the verge of collapse. I mean, I was surprised that they didn't have a barrier around it. But as I was observing that rotting balcony of wood, I noticed in the middle of it was a beautiful, vibrant, green ficus tree. This tree was growing out of the rotting, dilapidated wood that was about to collapse. True story. In spite of the destruction from the hurricane, the storm, this new life, had emerged as a symbol of hope, a symbol of renewal, a sign of peace. Therefore, when I looked at that structure, the sign that I saw was no longer that of destruction and dilapidated and rotting and aging. It was a sign of hope, a sign of peace. And my hope was that the people in that area would also see that new growth, that sign of peace. As Jesus and his disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee, they are moving from the Jewish side, the familiar side, to the Gentile side. Jesus was on a mission for all people. The side where they were was their home side. There were no strangers. The side they were going to was a new side, different, unfamiliar. Now, of course, some of us have crossed the Sea of Galilee, but many of us have not. But however, I would say, metaphorically speaking, we have all been in that boat that those disciples were in the midst of that storm. Sometimes the sea of life is rough, as it was for them. The wind is so strong, the waves are high. The boat, metaphorically, is taking on water, and sometimes we feel as though we are going to sink. We all know what this is like, or I would assume, at least those of us who are a little more seasoned in age. Some of our stories will begin with a phone call, a lab report, a doctor's visit, news we didn't want to hear, certainly didn't expect to hear. Some of them will start with choices that we have made personally or mistakes we've made. Other stories will tell about the difficulty of relationships, hopes and plans that fell apart, or the struggle to grow up and just find our way. Some storms seem to arise out of nowhere, and they take us by surprise, while other storms build and brew as we feel we helplessly watch. One doesn't have to look far beyond to see things going on in the world today, where we may feel hopeless or helpless as we watch the storm brew. Regardless of when or how these storms arise, they're about changing conditions, changing seasons. We all have seasons of life. There are better seasons than others, and there are rough seasons. Life can be overwhelming sometimes. Life can be wonderful sometimes. Sometimes we feel like we have control, other times we don't. Things often go our way, many times they don't. Circumstances seem too much for us to handle. Order gives way to chaos. We feel as though we're sinking. The water is so deep, and the new shore is on a distant horizon. Our faith can be shaken. The disciples are quick to make the storm all about Jesus in our gospel today. Don't you care that we're perishing? We've all probably echoed these words. I know I have. Where are you, God? Do something. Take it away from me. Make it better. Fix it, please. In the midst of the storm, Jesus seems absent, passive, uncaring. How can he sleep at a time like this? Especially when I need him most. Why is he so distant? Where are you, God? Well, here's some news for you. For us, for me. Sleeping Jesus, however, is in the same boat, in the same storm with his disciples. He is in the same boat, in the same storm with us. He is surrounded by the same water as the disciples, blown about by the wind, the beating of the waves on the boat. However, Jesus' response is oh so different, right? While the disciples are freaking out, fret and worry and anxious, Jesus sleeps. He's sleeping in a cushion in the stern of the boat. They're terrified. They feel abandoned. How can Jesus sleep? Get up, Jesus, do something. They want busyness. They want activity. Jesus sleeps in peace. He's sleeping in peace and in stillness. Remember who he is. He sleeps in peace and stillness amidst the storm, just like the mother bird in her nest. His sleep reveals that the greater storm and the real threat is not the wind, the waves, and the water around us, the circumstances in which we find ourselves, but the real storm is within us. The real storm, the more threatening storm, is what churns within us. That interior storm is the one that can blow us off course, beat against our faith, beat us down, make us question our faith, threaten even to take us to a point of despair and hopelessness. We feel powerlessness, a sense of abandonment, the unknown, judgment, criticism of ourselves, of others, and perhaps these waves continue to pound us down. And then Jesus utters the words, "Peace, be still." Jesus speaks to the wind and the sea, the churning up in our lives. Jesus isn't changing the weather as much as inviting the disciples to change, as he speaks to the wind and the waves within them. You see this powerful metaphor? Jesus now points to what is going on inside of them. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Now remember, earlier in Mark's Gospel, Jesus did so many healings, miraculous healings. These disciples witnessed these healings, the healings of a leper, the healing of a leper that people wouldn't go near, Jesus touched and healed. A man with a withered hand came to Jesus in the synagogue. Jesus made his hand whole. These disciples witnessed this, people, with their own eyes. And still, when they were in the boat with him, they were terrified after witnessing that. So take heart. We have not seen this with our eyes, and yet we still believe. So hold fast. Jesus' words are more about us than our circumstances in our lives and the storms that we meet. Because storms will happen. Storms will happen. Faith, more faith, better faith, stronger faith, truer faith, the right kind of faith will not eliminate storms. We're human. We live on this earth. There will be times in our lives where we will face storms. Faith does not change the storm, but it can change us. It can change us. But it's our choice. It's our choice. Faith does not take us around the storm. Nope. It's going to take us through the storm. And let me lighten it up a little bit here. My brother-in-law George is a helicopter pilot, worked for the military for many years, and one time he was telling me about a story when those of you aviators in here may be familiar, something lift, I can't remember the acronym, but they hit really rough air and it starts to affect the rotor. And the helicopter gets tumultuous, and it's very frightening because the inclination is to pull back and slow down. But if you pull back and slow down, you're pretty much doomed. You got to push through it. You got to push through the roughest of the air to get through it. And as my brother-in-law George said, once you get through that rough air, you hit this fresh, clean, smooth air, and you go up like a homesick angel. George's quote. I love that quote. Great guy. So faith is what allows us to push through and yet also to be still and know that he is God. Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. And just as we heard from our psalmist, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper and quieted the waves of the sea. And this was before Jesus. Faith is what allows us to be still, to be peaceful in the midst of the storm. The Spirit of God blows through and within us more mightily than the winds of any storm. Here's the good news. The power of God is stronger than any wave that beats against us. The love of God is deeper than any water that threatens to drown us. And every storm, Jesus is present, and his response is always the same. Very simple. Peace. Be still. Now, we all know about old Job. That poor guy went through it. We heard in the reading from the book of Job, God's dramatic answer to Job out of the whirlwind. Job had discussed God, had notions about him, and had prayed to him. But in the storm, Job sees him. As he states later in the text, I had heard about you before, but now I have seen you, God. And remember Job. If you haven't, read the book of Job. In every storm, there are choices to be made. We all have a choice. God has given us free will. That's how much he loves us. Free will. So do we put our faith in the power of the storm? Or do we put our faith in the power of Christ? Lukewarm faith will get us nowhere. It's all or nothing. Think about this, and you may disagree with me. In order to fully comprehend the peace of God, the peace that Jesus speaks when he says, peace be still, peace be still, we have to jump all in. There is having faith and there is not having faith. There is no in between. Because if you say you have faith and peace and trust, just a little bit of it, you don't have it. You got to jump all in. Do you have peace if you only give a portion of your life to God? Or if you trust him just a little? I would say no. At least I haven't experienced that. There are very few absolutes in this world. There are very few absolutes in our life on earth. But one that I believe to be so true and have personally experienced is one absolute, that the peace of God does surpass all human understanding. It's the best thing going. But here's the catch. Ironically, this peace is most often experienced in the midst of our trials and hardships. Seems counterintuitive, I know. In the midst of pain and suffering, in the midst of storms in our lives and throughout the world, that is when God comes closest to us. And I close with an illustration from best-selling author, writer, pastor, and I'm a big fan of his, Max Lucado, as he illustrates this sense of peace in his book, In the Eye of the Storm. I saw God, the God who can't sit still when the storm is too strong. The God who lets me get frightened enough to need him and then comes close enough for me to see him. The God who uses my storms as a path to come to me. I saw God. It took a storm for me to see him, but I saw him, and I will never be the same. Amen.
Amen.